Imagine an army of professionally trained soldiers losing to indigenous fighters. The Battle of Little Bighorn is one of the most unforgettable events in American history. This battle's been recorded in history books not only because of its unexpected outcome, but also for how it later affected the situation between the Indians, also known as Native Americans, and the Americans. Join us as we delve into the events of that fateful day, a day when powerful men found themselves at the mercy of those they considered inferior. The unforgettable Battle of Little Bighorn took place in June 1876. It's often referred to as Custer's Last Stand. This battle happened near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. It's a battle remembered not only for the shocking, unforeseen death of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, but also for the complete defeat of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Custer led. So what exactly caused this historic clash? The Battle of Little Bighorn was born of the Great Sioux War. The war was between Americans and Native American tribes. It all started when the American government tried to force the Lakota, or Sioux, Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes to move from their lands, the Black Hills, to reservations. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills, which was the sacred land of the Lakota Sioux, white settlers and miners rushed into the region, invading the home of these Native Americans. The Sioux had signed a treaty with the American government, which had guaranteed their ownership of the Black Hills. However, when these settlers invaded, the Americans responded by asking the Lakota Sioux and their allies to move to reserves, a demand they didn't take well. In 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed. It was intended to stop intertribal wars and protect white settlers and American interests, because warfare between tribes not only put the white settlers at risk, but also disturbed trade relations and encouraged unwanted and expensive intervention from the American authorities and military. The treaty defined the lands owned by 8 native tribes and demarcated their territories to prevent any attempts at expansion. The land was declared as a sovereign tribal territory, unclaimed by the United States. However, it also ensured the safe passage of travelers through the Oregon Trail and the building of roads and fortresses. But within a few years, conflict re-emerged. Former enemies had remained enemies, and as they trespassed on each other's land, tensions escalated. After vast amounts of gold were discovered on Indian lands, people seeking their fortune emigrated to the area, and despite the treaty, began establishing settlements. The American authorities made very little effort to prevent these breaches of the recently signed treaty, which only fueled resentment between all parties involved. Eventually, in 1866, the United States was forced to act, beginning the Red Clouds War. This was the war that ensued before the Great Sioux War. The conflict lasted for 2 years, resulting in the deaths of 200 American soldiers and civilians, and an unknown number of Native Americans. The war ended with the signing of the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. However, like the first, it was soon broken almost instantly, again by the encroaching white gold miners who were legally forbidden to enter the reservation. The hope for peace was fleeting, overshadowed by a cycle of broken promises and ongoing suffering. A decade later, in 1876, the Great Sioux War began. The Americans launched a 3-pronged campaign. The campaign involved separating their troops into columns and having them march into the Indian tribes' territory from different directions. This war involved a series of battles, including the Battle of Little Bighorn, which would later on make history. The purpose of this war was to force the native tribes to leave their lands and move to reservations. General George Crook, Colonel John Gibbon, and General Alfred Terry, along with Custer's 7th Cavalry, were tasked with finding the native forces led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other leaders, and bringing them under control. By June, the American troops had gathered together in Montana, setting the stage for a clash that would be remembered for generations. On the Native American side, the situation was one of unity and desperation. These tribes had been oppressed for a long time. Having been pushed to the limit, they had come together to join forces and resist further oppression. In June 1876, Sitting Bull, who was a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, had called for a sun dance. While participating in the ritual, Sitting Bull had a vision. In his vision, he saw soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers. Sitting Bull's vision sparked courage and determination in the fighters. They believed that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. The Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had managed to combine forces and raise an army of around 2,000 to 2,500 fighters. This number was more than thrice what Custer had, as he'd only gathered 700 men. The native tribes had outnumbered Custer's men and it played a significant role in their win. The warriors were determined. It wasn't just about the territory for them. They were fighting for their survival. They also needed to protect their families. So, when the chance came, they didn't hesitate to turn up in large numbers. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was a Civil War hero, and he was known for aggressive tactics during war. Custer had a reputation for being bold and sometimes reckless. During the Battle of Little Bighorn, his decisions that led to their defeat were a great testament to this. The battle cemented his legacy in a way he would have never imagined. General Terry had ordered Custer to follow a conservative approach when dealing with the native forces. However, true to his nature, Custer chose to do things differently. He split his troops into 3 battalions in an attempt to encircle and surprise the Native American camp. This decision, driven by Custer's confidence in his abilities and perhaps a desire for personal glory, would later prove to be a fatal error. On June 22, 1876, Custer and his men were sent out from the main troops to go out and scout. By the early morning of the 25th, Custer and his men had discovered a Native American camp. This camp was located approximately 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn River. They were now close to their objective, as they'd found the location to start the battle. A surprise attack was planned for the next day until one of Custer's scouts informed him that an enemy warband had discovered their trail. The decision was made to attack instantly, before the hostile force could catch up to him. The Battle of Little Bighorn commenced as Custer split his 700 men into 3 groups, one to prevent the escape of natives from the south, one to charge the village directly, and the last, commanded by Custer, would attack from the north. The attack began around midday, as Custer and his men mounted on horses entered the Little Bighorn Valley. Chief Sitting Bull and his men saw to the safety of the women and children, while Crazy Horse went to face Custer head-on. American intelligence had estimated there to be no more than 800 warriors in the encampment. In reality, there were 2,000 warriors, many of whom were better equipped than the Americans with rapid repeating rifles, compared to the American single-shot Springfields. Custer and his men, approximately 210 of them, were surrounded by the warriors and separated from their allies. The fight happened for not more than an hour, ending in Custer's death and the complete annihilation of his men. This location where Custer died has since been named Last Stand Hill. The battle was a great loss for the United States, as every soldier under Custer's command was killed. As no man survived to tell the true tale of Custer's last stand, the exact story of the battle is unknown. Later, native accounts of the battle were passed down through the generations via oral history, but they tend to be conflicting and unreliable. Custer's native Crow scout, Ashisha, gave a vague retelling of the battle some days later. The scout said that Custer had attacked the village head-on, but had been quickly driven back to Last Stand Hill, where he and his men soon met their demise. The 2 other groups sent to attack the village did not learn of Custer's defeat until 2 days later. They were shocked by the news and quickly rode to find them. The native warriors were already long gone, having taken most of their dead with them. All that remained on the battlefield were the 210 American dead. The men attempted to examine the battlefield to discover what exactly had occurred, but were unable to piece together the story. Captain Frederick Benteen, who had led the 3rd group, deduced from the site that it was a rout, a panic until the last man was killed. I think in all probability that the men turned their horses loose without any orders to do so. Many orders may have been given, but few obeyed. I think that they were panic-stricken. It was a rout. The American bodies had been robbed of much of their clothing and any useful possessions, such as guns and knives, and had also been viciously mutilated. Believing that one takes their body with them into the afterlife, the soldiers had their trigger fingers removed so that they couldn't fight in the afterlife. Meanwhile, Custer had knitting needles forced into his ears as he refused to listen. and an arrow stabbed into his genitals so he could not procreate. Still, on an active campaign, the bodies of the dead were hastily buried in shallow graves. The men had only a small number of digging tools between them, and so for many of the fallen men, their grave was nothing more than a few shovelfuls of dirt placed on top of them. Custer had the most prestigious grave, 18 inches deep, and marked with stakes driven into the ground. His name was written on a piece of paper, which was rolled up into a spent cartridge case and driven into the stake as the cause of death. It seemed Custer had been shot in the heart. He had a gunshot wound to his head, but as this hadn't bled, this was probably done after his death. The battle was a brief but incredible victory for the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes. But while they'd won the battle, they were well aware that they hadn't won the war. The Americans later went after them for revenge. They subdued the native tribes and made them surrender.